Welcome back to Hot Take City, where I complain about long-standing, deeply entrenched elements of our game that are widely accepted and taken for granted, but I think are actually terrible. But this is not complaining just because I like to complain and I like drama, even though both of those things are true. But I view complaining as an ultimately positive act because I don't like wallowing in negativity. I want to complain so that we can shed light on the true nature of whatever subject it is. You know, whether or not hazards are broken, or switch moves are broken, or trapping is broken. Those are all three videos I made recently, which you can feel free to check out. Or in this case, this is a positive act insofar as it will get us to finally accept that Snorlax in Gen 3 is actually terrible. So, where am I coming from with this? Because I don't think Snorlax is a bad Pokemon in and of itself. I think that Snorlax actually does a lot of really cool things, and it can be really, really threatening. The problem is, this actually is not unique to Snorlax. The problem is that Snorlax requires way too much support to compensate for its shortcomings, which are many and are all heavily, heavily significant. And to skimp on any of them tends to be game breaking in a lot of matchups against the strongest, most popular teams in the metagame. So, what do I mean by this? Well, Snorlax used to be considered one of the best Pokemon in Advance. Obviously not GSC tier, but it was, one of the biggest threats. Everyone who gets into Advance goes, oh, Snorlax is like the offensive Blissey. And it's cool because it can self-destruct and it has stab and it hits everything really hard and it's great. And it still hits really well with the Cursed Rest set, and it can threaten to sweep. And, oh, wow, that's awesome. So, first of all, we are going to get this out of the way. Cursed Rest Snorlax in Advance is bad. Horrible. Abhorrent. It's so bad that I think anyone who brings it is either clueless or trolling. Okay, that's an exaggeration. I don't actually think that. But every time I think... Actually, I don't think any more about bringing Cursed Rest Snorlax, but every time I thought of it before, I was like, let me consider this as an option, because it's not something I usually use. And then every time I was like, oh, right, that's why I don't use it, because it's bad. Like, seriously, to me, Snorlax in Advance with the Cursed Rest set is basically like a UU Pokemon, or an NU Pokemon, and not in the cool, underrated set way. Like, oh, this UU Pokemon is actually good. No, it's not like that at all. It's more in the, why are you bringing this? You were just putting yourself at an enormous disadvantage. So Cursed Rest is out the window. Why is Cursed Rest out the window? Well, the issues that Cursed Rest has are the same that any Snorlax has, like a more offensive boom set. However, Cursed Rest is so passive and weak and takes forever to get going that its issues are amplified a lot more, whereas Snorlax's offensive sets, by virtue of self-destruct being so strong, mean that at least it can get around, or like it can use its power to compensate for its flaws a little bit. So what are these flaws? Well, let's look at the usage statistics of Gen 3 OU from this past SPL, because we're only going off recent data, just so it's not like I pick a game from 15 years ago and see, Snorlax is bad. Now, usage stats are not gospel. I feel very strongly about this. In fact, a lot of people cite win rate, and if I was one of those people, I'd be like, look, Snorlax only has a 39-ish% win rate this season. Look how bad it is. And I don't think that's the case at all. I have an entire video dedicated to why win rate is a terrible, terrible statistic. But we're going to use this just to show how stacked the deck is against Snorlax. Now, this does not mean that Snorlax cannot overcome this, but the amount of support it needs to be able to do this is a lot, and it really struggles to do it consistently. And this is very much in line with the viability rankings. So if we look at the viability rankings, even before the stats, then we see a metagame that is incredibly naturally hostile to Snorlax. First, so Snorlax's most famous issues are sand and spikes, because they greatly impede its ability to take hits, right? Okay, fair, easy. You can deal with both, but dealing with both is famously hard. That's the problem. Snorlax is also very slow, and it's bulky, but not that bulky, and its only method of healing is rest. So it's like an offensive Blissey, except it dies really, really fast under very common, very easy to set battle conditions. I lead off with T-Tar, and just by leading off with T-Tar, Snorlax is easier to deal with. I haven't even clicked a move yet, and I already am going to have much fewer problems with Snorlax. So that's problem number one. Even switching into something as innocuous as like a Milotic Surf, which bounces off of Snorlax, winds up being significant because now it's more threatened by Salaman's Brick Break or something, or Zapdos Thunderbolt, or even like mixed Tyranitar or something. Basically, every little hit sticks to Snorlax, and it doesn't have the instant recovery of Blissey, and it doesn't have such enormous bulk that, something like, because Blissey can switch into Zapdos T-Bolt like 5 times before it even thinks about soft boiling. Exaggeration. But it also can soft boil, where Snorlax is just on an incredibly fast ticking timer from the word go. It's very frustrating because I love Snorlax's offensive potential, but it just gets worn down so unbelievably quickly. And that's before spikes are in the picture. And spikes are most commonly set by Skarmory, which warps the tier around it. And even with Magneton, don't worry, we'll get to Magneton support, but that's not... I'm trying to stick to the vague structure I have in my head. But the problem of dealing with Skarmory and its spikes are very much tied to Snorlax's issues. So Sand, no survivability, but at least it can boom, right? Well, that's the thing. Snorlax's boom is strong, for sure, but it also has to contend with a lot of normal resistances in the highest ranks. Skarm, T-Tar, Metagross, which, forget trapping that with Magneton at all reliably. It just bounces. It threatens Snorlax most directly, even more than Tyranitar. Gengar, of course, is completely blanks even like a curse boosted self-destruct. Threatens Will-O-Wisp. So, and consider how commonly these Pokemon are paired together. So here's a very common scenario. Snorlax switches into Zapdos, right? Because if Snorlax isn't switching into Zapdos, you have another special wall or something. Well, okay, there aren't that many good switches to Zapdos, so you're going to be using Snorlax for it. You take a big Thunderbolt and Sand, 25% or so, and then you have to contend with with a combination of T-Tar, Skarm, Metagross, Gengar. I mean, you're not getting anything done in that scenario. And that's a very common setup. First of all, it's the most popular team setup, roughly. Some variant of Skarmory spikes with Sand supporting it. And look at how common it is. It's not just that it's the most powerful, so you should be prepared for it. You're going to be facing it consistently. Look, T-Tar, Skarm, Metagross, all firmly in the top 5. And with Sand in the picture, even something as innocuous as switching into like a Blissey Seismic Toss, it's like, well, that's in range for something now, especially with spikes down. It's so limited in your way of being able to deal with it. And this is to say nothing of mixed or non-cursed Snorlax's struggles to get past something like a Wish Protect Jirachi, or it can get past Selby, but it's gonna have to blow itself up and then have fun not having your wall. And that's ultimately why Snorlax struggles. For its team, it has to be a defensive anchor and an offensive threat at the same time, but its offensive threat anchors around blowing itself up, and as soon as you blow yourself up, say goodbye to your defensive anchor. And the offense you're supporting with such teams like Magneton offense or Magneton-less offense, which is then you're not. The threats you're enabling are not so big. It's not like a later generation where the base power of everything is so huge that it's worth it to just sacrifice something you might need defensively because your sweeper is going to win as a result. Unless you're playing a very frail team, but that is not the norm. If you're playing another offense team, Snorlax actually gets a lot better simply because it's going to stick and its damage is going to stick more easily, and the offensive Pokemon it's enabling are a lot more threatening by virtue of the other team being offensive. However, if you're playing bulky stuff, then Snorlax is still getting worn down, its damage is less likely to stick, and its offensive teammates are less easily able to pick up the slack offensively. Because it's like, yeah, my Snorlax boomed on a Metagross, and I still have to get through, Blissey and Gengar and T-Tar for my physical sweeper to be able to sweep. To say nothing of if there's like a Suicune or a Salamence or a Zapdos. Good lord, it's just so the teams that Snorlax fits on. These Magaton offenses. If you have so now we can get into the Sand and Spikes thing. It's not that Snorlax is bad because blowing up something like Metagross or Celebi is great. It's just that you are not able to fit enough on a team with Snorlax. There are ways that players have tried, but it never feels satisfactory. The closest I've felt was satisfactory was when I saw Snorlax being used alongside Blissey. And I actually thought that was pretty cool, but it's an unusual style of team. And the standardized versions of these Pokemon, or of these teams, these offensive styles, then I don't think they're good at all because they struggle defensively against everything. And they're not good enough offensively against standard defensive stuff. On a consistent basis, I mean. Once in a while, yes, okay, they can be threatening, but more often than not, they're just getting ruined by Dugtrio and all the other stuff I did. Starmie, good lord. Yeah, Snorlax being so slow is also a huge, huge factor in making its sand-affected nature significant. Because Zapdos also is affected by, putting aside its Spikes weakness. Or let's take Celebi, I guess, because that's also affected by Sand and Spikes. Yeah, that's also affected by Sand and Spikes. And not every Celebi set heals, but it's got a good speed stat, so it's still useful against several Pokemon, even when it's at low HP, depending on how you use it. Snorlax dips to low HP, and suddenly it's outrun and KO'd by literally everything. So, yeah. So now the team's built like a Magneton offense. Then if you use Magneton, you're not going to have to deal with Skarmory. That's true. But you are a lot worse defensively, and you are still going to have to deal with the spike that Skarmory leaves behind. And it doesn't even matter that Skarm, is out of the picture when you were getting worn down so rich. I mean, look, Snorlax gets, as you saw in this game, crit notwithstanding, then that Snorlax doesn't get crit, and let's pretend that there's a Metagross here instead of Breloom, and it just thuds into that, and it's really ugly. It's going to have to blow up later, but it can still go very, very wrong. So, and that would have been much more expected, much more common occurrence. So Magneton offense doesn't have to deal with Skarm, but it doesn't have a good defensive backbone, and its offenses are generally not enough to make the effort worthwhile. And if you run an offensive team without Magneton, then Skarmory is just going to be an absolute nightmare. And you also will still generally have the problem of offense not being strong enough in advance. So I mentioned the defensive variants of Snorlax being terrible because they're passive and weak, and it needs so much support to not be complete dead weight. Because again, at least offensive Lax can pull its weight just by virtue of being strong and having, self-destruct. But, it's still flawed, but at least, the muscle can make it worthwhile on occasion, even if you're still going to struggle against Skarm and friends a lot. So, especially with sand. There's been a trend lately of not using sand as much, and that makes Snorlax better, but in standard conditions of sand being everywhere, then Anyway, so, but yeah, okay, so Snorlax's issues of sand and spikes are not easy to circumvent. Yeah, players have tried using things like Rain Dance on things like Zapdos, and I even saw a Rain Dance Gyarados, which I actually thought was pretty cool, but it's hard to fit, it's hard to pull off reliably, because you also will need to dedicate a slot to Dugtrio in order to reliably remove T-Tar, or you have to go through some, really specific T-Tar lures that are not guaranteed to work, and are difficult to fit on a team. And that's the problem. It's not that you can't compensate for Lax's flaws, it's that you can't compensate for Lax's flaws while still maintaining a decent team. It's really difficult to do so because the stuff that you use to compensate for its flaws is so spread out and so specific. You need something to ruin Scarm and to deal with spikes. And you need to compensate for sand somehow. I mean, something like Wish Support can help, but I mean, this is so many Pokemon. And it's not like you'd be using bad Pokemon, but it's so many Pokemon that are going to be dedicated to supporting Snorlax, and it's too much for too little, too often. Now, okay, if you face an offensive team and there's no sand, or even if there is sand, then you can still get a boom off, potentially. But if there's no sand, then yeah, Lax is great. But too often, you're just going to be struggling, fighting an uphill battle, and for what reward? That's the thing. You are not getting enough out of Snorlax. Oh, another problem Snorlax has in comparison to Blissey, which it does get compared to. Blissey really feels better on offense a lot of the time, just because it also does takes on status because of Natural Cure. Snorlax is terrified of status. It absolutely gets ruined. Whereas Blissey is like, oh, I got Will-O-Wisp, who cares? And with Snorlax, you have a special wall that can't take on half the special attackers in the tier, like Moltres and Gengar, because it can't deal with status at all. Snorlax does have a nice immunity to Toxic with its immunity ability, but I don't know, it's just not worth it in my opinion. In this final game, we'll see an example of how exploitable a bulky Snorlax team can be, just because in order to make up for all of Snorlax's flaws if you want to go defensive, you have to go pure defense, and that is just not doing damage, and you are not rushing the opponent at all. You're not putting any pressure on them. They can play their game all day. Meanwhile, they're pressuring you because your special wall is something like even look at the Zapdos, right? Because Triangles is going to have Jirachi and then a Claydol for spin support and a Snorlax. And still, just switching into something as simple as a T-Wave Zapdos is nightmarish, because Claydol's not a counter, and Jirachi gets paralyzed, which impedes its ability to wall a lot, and Snorlax can't switch in because, first of all, it's not going to be doing much with the curse, that curse rest scenario. And second of all, it's also not good at taking T-Bolts in sand, so it's going to have to rest, and then, nightmare. So you're going to have to dedicate yourself to all these defensive Pokemon with, your Scarm removal or Scarm crippling, if you want to run knockoff Hariyama or something. I mean, which I like, but again, not enough slots to make up for all these problems. And then you got your Spin, which you're going to need. And, you might want to fit in your Weather Clearing. Maybe you want to fit in Heal Bell, Celebi, or Blissey to help with Snorlax's I mean, it's going to be Celebi because you don't want Blissey and Snorlax on such a defensive team. If you're going to run Blissey and Lax on a team together, it should be offensive. Yeah, so it's just not worth it. I do think Snorlax is worth it sometimes, and I do commend the players who have been trying to make it work. It's just that and again, this is why I say complaining is a positive act. We need a new mode of using Snorlax because the old versions, okay, first of all, Curse Restlax is very rarely used for good reason. That is already established that it's passive and weak and needs Mag Trio support, and even those all-in on Snorlax teams, not only are they extremely inflexible and get run over by so many different matchups, but they're not even guaranteed to win their own matchup, so it's like, what are you doing this for? But the offensive versions, we need something new. I liked Baihai's Registeel thing. I thought that was cool, because Registeel is like Snorlax in that it takes special hits well, but it heals in sand, and that already makes a big, big difference. Also, it also has some actual resists, and that's another thing about Lax. Blissey can afford to be a special wall with no resists, because it's that bulky and has recovery. But Snorlax not having any resist means that it can't switch into anything nearly as well because of its aforementioned defensive flaws. So Starmie gets crit there. We want to move this along. Speaking of para, then stuff happens. T-Tar comes in. Yeah, so I don't know. I do like this kind of team with Blissey over Snorlax quite a bit, and that's the whole point. Like half the time I use Snorlax, I wind up saying I want to use Blissey instead because it does so much better defensively. I mean, like even something like an offensive Calm Minder winds up being terrifying when you with Blissey. It's like, yeah, who cares? It's an offensive Calm Minder, and with Snorlax, it's like, oh man, I can't threaten this one on one. I can't both take its attacks and beat it easily one on one. I can't heal its damage off. No, Snorlax gets absolutely obliterated by pretty much everyone and doesn't threaten them much in return when you're running Curse Rest. So, yeah, nightmarish. Even something like switching into Will-O-Wisp here is so much harder because if you use like something like a Rest Hawk Magneton, which is actually pretty cool, then yeah, that's fine, but it can't be your own. That's more for offensive teams that need temporary relief because you can't use it permanently because then you get Dugtrio'd. And with Blissey, then that's a lot more palatable. Also, because you also have Rest Suicune, but for something like Moltres, I mean. But I don't know, just it's so you get forced in the defensive so much more easily when you don't have Blissey. I mean, this video could also be titled "Why Blissey is is so ridiculously broken." So then T-Tar crits with Rock Slide immediately. I mean, forget that it dodged a Mega Horn. But even see, because this Snorlax needs Shadow Ball to have to hit Gengar, because the team doesn't have Pursuit support, so it can't fit EQ. Which is another problem with Snorlax. But even if it did have EQ, it's going to get forced to rest, most likely, and there's Heracross, which can help with that. And as soon as it rests, you think, oh, well, it takes these Rock Slides all day. And then as soon as it's going to rest, then that T-Tar has Focus Punch. And, you know, say goodbye to that. And that's the final issue with Snorlax, that it cannot... if it was a better Pokemon, it would not be nearly as crippling an issue, but it just can't fit all the moves it wants. Like, take an offensive set with Magneton support, so you don't have to even think about running something like Fire Blast, right? Or Focus Punch, because people used to use Focus Punch because it chipped down Skarmory and then it gets ruined by Drill Peck, so it's just, nah. So you want Body Slam, Shadow Ball, EQ, Self-Destruct, right? But you would also really like Curse, because that lets you actually go one-on-one against something like a Metagross, defensive Metagross, as opposed to just getting ruined by it. It helps you pressure Wish Jirachi, which just wants to sit on you and stall out your Earthquakes, which it actually does quite well with the Bold set. It might let you beat Celebi. It can help against something like Bold Suicune that might otherwise force you to blow up on it. You know, being able to beat it without that is great. Where do you fit a Curse? Oh, if you lose Body Slam, then, I mean, it's doable, but not having Body Slam sucks. Your best move in a Zapdos one-on-one is, you know, either Shadow Ball or, you know, Shadow Ball, because otherwise you just risk blowing up into nothing. And then say goodbye to your Zapdos answer, and there are not that many Zapdos answers out there. So that's what I mean by new mode of Snorlax team. You got to use Snorlax and another special wall, and that's really, really limiting. And it's not like later gens where you can compensate for the lack of special wall by using a really fast, strong slew of attackers, because those attackers just aren't fast or strong enough. They're going to struggle to break through walls, and they don't have enough natural defensive presence to take on opposing offensive threats. Anyway, so if you want to run Curse, Body Slam, EQ, Boomlax, which I think is its strongest set for the record, then that's great, but you're going to need Pursuit support in addition to Magneton support, and you're still going to get worn down really quickly switching into anything with not just in sand, but especially with a layer of spikes up. So, I mean, either have fun slotting a Rapid Spinner on your team, which is going to limit it even more, or just getting ruined by one layer of spikes, even if Magneton successfully traps Skarmory. And before anyone has the idea, oh, well, can't you just limit Skarmory to no spikes? No. No, that's not something you can ever consistently rely on. And then you just, you know, collapse under the pressure of, you know, Salamence and Moltres and Zapdos and Starmie and offensive Calm Minders and just everything imaginable. And to forget removing sand, by the way, because if you want your team to be actually decent, your Pursuiter is going to be Tyranitar. And and you can say, oh, well, what about Umbreon or Houndoom? Now, I mean, feasibly Metagross, but Metagross struggles to trap Gengar, first of all. Umbreon is going to make your team even frailer and more, or not frailer, but frailer in the sense of I can't do any damage, so you effectively become even more terrorized by offensive Calm Minders, just for example, or like anything that sets up, or like Metagross, good lord. Whereas the others can at least put on offensive pressure. And Houndoom, I like Houndoom, but it's just so frail. Yeah, whereas T-Tar is the best for the choice, for the job by far. So, yeah, I mean, you can run T-Tar in like Weather Clearing and Rapid Spin, but I mean, you might as well just run Sunny Day on that Magneton anyway, because it's a pretty good move choice. But it's never going to be that consistent, and that's why we need to find a new mode of using Snorlax offensively, because we know the defensive ones are bad, and the offensive ones have potential, but the traditional ways of using them are terrible. And that is why Snorlax struggles so much in-game, and why it is not used nearly as much. I mean, the deck is stacked against it, but it can do better. Thank you for watching. I hope this was useful for you, and I will see you in the next one.